Chris, thanks for making time to talk to me. I'm talking now with Chris Lyle, who's an international aviation policy consultant with a very distinguished track record of working in the area of aviation policy internationally. Chris, I wanted to speak to you about how you see the management of aviation towards a more sustainable future. I think you and I both agree that there has to be change. I think there are some differences between us about the best strategy for getting that change. But today is not about a conversation between you and I. It's much more an opportunity for you to tell the people who are going to see this video how you see the transition towards a more sustainable form of aviation. So over to you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I think one of the things that's happened in the last few years is that the issue of aviation emissions has really got into the mainstream, which it hasn't in the past, despite the fact that the issue is growth in aviation, because the technological and operational changes that have been made to try and reduce emissions have been inadequate to counter against the emissions. And one of the problems with aviation is it's very, very difficult. It's probably the hardest sector to get away from fossil fuels. So something needs to be done. In the past, it has been the responsibility, international aviation at least, has been the responsibility of the International Civil Aviation Organization and shipping, the International Maritime Organization. It was sort of taken out of the mainstream in the Kyoto Protocol 1997. But now there's a move to get it back, because what happens is when you give something to somewhere like the International Civil Aviation Organization, you've got 193 countries, you've got the principle of equal application, so one country is not allowed to do more than another, and at the moment it's still growing. I mean, international aviation is about 2.8% of emissions worldwide, and the international aviation is as much as, for example, it's 1.5 times that of the whole of the United Kingdom's emissions. So it's not a small issue, but unfortunately it's not treated in the right way. So I think moving forward, the most important thing, I think, will be for international aviation to be put back into the mainstream so that it's included in these things called nationally determined contributions of individual countries. And countries can put it back on their own desire if they wish to, and the United Kingdom has done. I give it its due. It has included international aviation in its latest submissions, but obviously we need to get it back in there so that the pressure is on and it's not sort of diffused as it is at the present time. And then I think the way to move forward, and it has to be fast, that there are alternatives now out there. In fact, almost too many alternatives out there in the terms of what's called sustainable aviation fuels, electric fuels, hydrogen. And electric, I think, will be with us fairly soon. The short haul and smaller aircraft, but unfortunately, because of particularly batteries, you've got heavy batteries, you just don't have the range with them. And then hydrogen, of course, is the big issue at the present time. You've got Airbus pushing hydrogen very hard as a possibility, but we then have to look at hydrogen supply, and it has to be green hydrogen rather than blue or grey hydrogen, they call blue, those coloured hydrogens. So it has to be, from that point of view, it has to be clean hydrogen. The other issue with hydrogen, of course, and with electric for that matter, is that it requires a different infrastructure. The great advantage of sustainable aviation fuels is that you can deliver them through the same pipeline to the airport, and they're called drop-in fuels, so they can just drop into the aircraft in the same way as anywhere else. The downside is that some of them are not really sustainable. A lot of them are not really sustainable. If you look at the full life cycle, and they're including, things like palm oil or sugar, for example, and so on. So it's really, you're limited to biofuels from waste, essentially. And then there's something called e-fuels, which are very, very hopeful, I think, where you actually create synthetic fuel from, actually, in some cases, from carbon dioxide. The problem with that is that it costs a lot of money. So obviously there has to be some way forward. All these options should be on the table, I believe. They should all be on the table. But there has to be incentives for bringing it forward, because with, for example, the cheapest biofuels are about 3 times the cost of regular fossil fuels. So they're obviously, prices will come down as developments occur, but obviously there has to be help. So governments have to be involved. And I believe the tourism industry itself should be involved, because one of the concerns I have is that I frequently see, aviation is only 2% of carbon dioxide, but we are we create a multiplier of 6 times our economic benefit because of that multiplier. But what they doesn't say is that multiplier includes additional CO2. Those other industries, for example, the tourism industry has CO2 to be added. So in fact, aviation's contribution becomes much more significant. It is a very important contribution to the total in global warming. And at the same time, you've got this outfit called Climate Action Tracker, who does very good analysis of how well each country is doing in terms of its contributions. And it has done international aviation recently and has ranked it as the worst level, critically insufficient. It's equivalent to a 4-degree centigrade world. So I think, the tourism industry has to look at what the contribution, not in the silo of tourism, i.e., it's okay wonderful to have your solar powered heating in the hotel, your clean water, providing local employment and so on. But you have to look at the whole package, and likewise aviation needs to look at its whole package. And I think the tourism sector and individuals now, while I said aviation is only 2.8% of world CO2, for an individual traveler who goes by air, it's a very high proportion of their so-called carbon budget. And I think the more people see that and are able to realize that impact, and I'm a big proponent of something called carbon labeling, whereby when you first sign in for your travel or your package holiday or whatever, you're given options and you're told, what you're going to produce in terms of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So I guess that's a sort of general statement of where I feel. I don't know what anything specific you'd like me to talk about.
But maybe just to mention, Chris, that of course we've recently seen the, I think, really big change that Google will bring to the marketplace with its carbon labeling, because I'm sure the airlines are going to jump up and down and say that's not fair, it's a bit less and so on. But in reality, what Google has done is create the kind of information that travelers need to be able to make an informed decision. So I think that's a really important change. But maybe I'd just like a few words with you as we come to the end of this. How do you see ICAO being reformed?
Well, ICAO has broader issues, obviously, than its work on climate change.
Sure.
But one of the problems it has had with climate change is that there is a principle in the Chicago Convention, which is the one that established the organization way back in 1944, that says there has to be equal application. So therefore, you cannot have the UK doing more and United States or China or somebody doing less. So what you get out of it when they have to reach agreement is what I call the lowest common denominator. It's minimal. That they've established, ICAO for a long time has established standards on both initially noise and then on emissions for aircraft. And those were fine, except they were driven by industry, so they reflect rather than direct economics. But those have proved very insufficient in terms of the growth of travel. The growth of travel has exceeded those improvements. So they've had to move into fields with which they're not familiar, like economic fields. And in the environment, it's moved into fields where they're certainly not, not experts in terms of land use, for example. Is this fuel adequate because of the land use that the other people it's been putting out, because it uses palm oil and so on? And that has to change. That very much has to change. ICAO is the body, certainly is the expert body in doing what they call monitoring, reporting, and verification. But in terms of policy, I think individual governments, regional governments, particularly European Union, has always taken a lead. And one of the issues it's had in ICAO is that it's gone too fast and they've been slowed down. I think that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has to make a stronger statement about aviation and the need to do something about it. I've seen figures that say that by 2050, if it was business as usual, aviation would be the largest single source of aviation emissions, and often they're not measured properly. I mean, for example, when you separate international aviation from the rest, you get a situation like you see at Heathrow. Heathrow Airport is the largest single source of aviation of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
But in fact, most of them are the ground transport. Most of that is not the airplanes, but it's all the traffic to and from the airport and the business that around the airport. So I think we need to look in a broader context at the costs and benefits, and that applies particularly, I think, in the field of tourism, because there are undoubted benefits of tourism, but they have to be looked at in the context of the emissions, not just at the destination or even the origin, but of the flight, of course.
Yeah, I think trying to encourage people to think a little bit more holistically about the challenges that face us as a species in terms of our sustainability on the planet is clearly critical. Chris, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. I'm sure that I'm going to want to speak with you again, and maybe you, Paul Peters, and I should arrange to have a conversation post COP26. Time perhaps to see the dust settle, and perhaps in early December do an interview between the three of us again, talking about how we think things have changed as a consequence of COP26.
Yeah, we'll be pleased to do that.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. Really